but traditionally they've always been included in the nativity scenes. So I'd like to read in the second chapter of Matthew, the first 12 verses. It says, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, 'Where is the one who has been born the King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him.' When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. 'In Bethlehem in Judea,' they replied, 'for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel.' Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and make a careful search.'" Where is it? Oh, there it is. Lost my page. It's stuck to the other one. "Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and of incense and of myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Excuse me just a minute, I got to get a drink. I'm getting dry. Now the Magi, they were originally a tribe of the Medes who were in the area of Persia, which is Iran today. They were teachers of the Persian kings. And they were very intelligent and very highly skilled people, especially in philosophy, medicine, the natural sciences. They were astronomers, astrologers, soothsayers, and interpreters of dreams. Now you got to remember, back in those days, practically everybody believed in astrology. They believed that the future could be predicted from the movement of stars, and they believed very strongly whatever star or whatever sign that a person was born under, that determined their destiny. Now the stars appear to have a very fixed course, so they represent the order of the universe, God's order. And if something suddenly appeared like a brilliant star, it looked like God was breaking into his own order, his own universe, to announce something special. Now there's nothing that tells us that how they knew what the star meant. Maybe some revelation not known to us may have been given to them. It's possible they learned a lot from the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, when Daniel and some of the other Jews were among these eastern countries. They may have known some written or oral revelations that we don't have any records of. But one thing we do know, and the important thing, is that they came to worship the newborn king. Now they knew that this baby was not an ordinary human. And so the Magi went to Jerusalem because it was the Jewish capital. Now the present king lived there, so a newborn king, an heir to the throne, would naturally be expected to live there. And apparently they began to inquire as soon as they arrived, asking people in Jerusalem if they knew anything about a new king. And they couldn't find anybody that knew. Now there were people that knew, people like Simeon and Anna. If you remember, they were at the temple when Jesus was taken there at 40 days as required by the Mosaic law. But the news of Jesus' birth was very good news to everybody, the shepherds and the Magi. But there was one person in Jerusalem that it was very bad news to. King Herod, he was troubled because he was the king and he didn't want any kind of a rival to his throne. Now Herod had many, many flaws, but one really stood out. And he was quite a guy when you really read some of the stuff he did. But he was insanely suspicious. And he got to the point where he thought everybody was trying to get rid of him. And he went so far as he had his wife murdered, his mother-in-law murdered, and 3 of his sons murdered. And before he died, he had many of the leaders of Jerusalem arrested and gave an order that at the moment of his birth, they were to be killed. And the reason he did that was because he knew that no one would cry when he died, and he wanted tears shed at his death. So this was the type of man that the Magi were going to talk to about this new king. Now to say Herod was trouble was kind of put it mildly. He would absolutely stop at nothing. I mean nothing if somebody was challenging him. Now Herod was half Jew, and because of that he knew enough about the Jews to know that they were expecting this conquering leader called the Messiah. But he didn't know the prophecy that named the place of his birth. It was a strange world back then, and there was a feeling apparently in the world at that time of expectation that something spectacular was about to happen. Some of the things that show that are the Roman historian Suetonius. He said that there had spread over all the Orient an old and established belief that it was fated at that time for a man coming from Judea to rule the world. Josephus, probably most of you have heard of Josephus. He was a Jewish historian. He said the Jews had the belief that about that time, one from their country should become governor of the habitable world. And almost at the same time that Jesus was born, Augustus, who was the emperor at the time, was being hailed as the savior of the world. And Virgil, who was a Roman poet, wrote his messianic epilogue about the golden age to come. So there was a feeling in the world that something was going to happen. There isn't any reason to believe that the visit of the Magi was legend. It's exactly the kind of thing that would have happened. And a lot of it was because of this expectation the world had. Men were waiting for God. After all, it had been 400 years since they had heard from God. And their desire for God was in the Jews' hearts. And hearing that the star had announced a new king, Herod reasoned that this child must be the Messiah. So he called the Jewish leaders together to help him find the baby. And as expected, they had the answer. The chief priests, of course, were the leaders of the temple and also the leading political leaders of the Jews. And the scribes were the scholars and the teachers. And they gave him the answer. And no doubt it was instant and unanimous because Herod asked men who were well versed in the Old Testament scriptures. And there's something very interesting in the reactions of these 3 groups of people: the Magi, Herod, and the chief priests. Herod's reaction to Jesus was hatred and hostility. And Herod believed that Jesus would interfere with what Herod wanted to do. The chief priests knew the prophecies, and they were looking forward to the coming of the Messiah, but they were too wrapped up in their temple ritual to realize who he was or even care who he was. And then finally, the Magi recognized who he was, and they came to worship him. And today, those same 3 groups of people exist: the people who don't care, the people who hate Jesus, and the people who love Jesus and worship him. As we know, the Magi went out, they found a newborn, but Herod didn't. So this baby born in Bethlehem lived to grow to manhood. He taught in Galilee, he suffered and died for mankind, and he rose from the dead, as foretold in the Scriptures. And most important is, he lives today. He rules at God's hands and will continue till the triumph of his kingdom is complete. And through all the centuries of history, the promises of God have been kept. And we can be sure no promise of his will ever fail. Jesus truly fulfilled the requirements of the Messiah. Okay, so we know the Magi came to Jerusalem to see and worship Jesus. We know what they did, but who were these guys? We don't know. We don't know who they were. There's no record of their names or their number of them even. But tradition, and if you like tradition, I love traditions and legends. I think they're really interesting and a lot of fun to listen to. But tradition has a lot to say about it. The early traditions said there were 12 of these Magi came. But that was eventually changed to 3, just strictly because there were 3 gifts. And it's very, very unlikely that there were only 3 men that made that journey to Jerusalem. They were very important men in their country. They were the advisors to the kings. And they would have traveled in a large caravan. They'd be something like today, like the Secretary of State of different countries. And when they travel, they take a bunch of people with them. And in this group of the Magi, there were probably hundreds or maybe even 1,000 people in that entourage. They just didn't do this. It was unsafe for them. There were robbers all over the place out there. And they wouldn't travel like that. And can you imagine what would happen if 1,000 people would show up on camels in Jerusalem? I mean, everybody would get all excited. Who are these guys and everything? But the gifts are a very interesting thing that they brought. Each gift matches a different characteristic of Jesus. The gold is the king of metals, and it's a gift for a king. The frankincense was used in temple sacrifices, and that's a gift for a priest. And the myrrh was used to embalm bodies, and that's a gift for one who is to die. And the gifts really came in handy for these people, because if you remember, right not too long after Jesus was born, that's when Herod was going to start the slaughter of the children, and they had to make the journey to Egypt. Well, they were poor people, and this gold came in handy and helped them make that trip. The Magi aren't named in the Scripture, but tradition is taking care of that too. And most of you are familiar with their names, but they've been named. They've been given descriptions on what the different ones look like, and they have been named as saints in the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox Church. They have a feast day. Their feast day is on January the 6th. Epiphany, I think is what they call it, chief of the Feast of Epiphany. But their names are Melchior. Now Melchior, traditionally he was an old man. He had gray hair and a long beard, and he's the one that brought the gold. We have Caspar. He was young and no beard and brought the frankincense. And then Balthazar was olive skinned and had a beard and brought the myrrh. Now, Balthazar, I'm probably most, boy, it's a bright light. This I feel like the wise men, when they look at this bright star, that's kind of the way that light is. I've complained about it, but it doesn't do any good. And haven't I, Russ? But anyway, I don't even know where I was. Where was I? Balthazar. Balthazar, if you've seen the movie Ben-Hur. Everybody seen Ben-Hur? A few. How many have not even ever heard of the movie Ben-Hur? Younger people? Yeah. Anyway, Ben-Hur, it's a story. Don't turn it up that bright. That's all right. It's all right, Russ. Thank you for trying. But anyway, in Ben-Hur, it's a story of Christ. And Ben-Hur he ends up being a slave and all this. But Balthazar was at the beginning. The movie starts off when Jesus is born. And Balthazar was there with the other two. And then toward the end of the movie, at the crucifixion, Balthazar is there again. And apparently he became a follower of Jesus and became very active and very, big in the movement. So anyway, that and 50 cents will get you a Coke someplace. But anyway, when the wise men left Bethlehem and Jesus, it says they went home a different way. And of course, God's directed them to do that in order to avoid meeting Herod again. But there's a rich truth in all this, that no man who has truly seen Jesus can ever go home the same way. He goes home a different way because he's a different person. There's an old hymn, and I think we've sang it in here a few times with Chris up here. It goes, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. And when we truly know Jesus, things take on a different meaning, and we have a different outlook on life. And the story of Jesus' birth was hailed as good news on that night, and good news it was. It was good news for Mary, Joseph, the shepherds, the wise men, and especially good news for the entire world. You guys want to come back up? We're going to sing I always call it an invitation song. If there's anyone here today that needs to make any kind of decision, like on, if you're interested in maybe being baptized or just moving your membership or coming up for prayer, we'll have prayer partners up here on the sides. So just feel free to come up.